We will start off with going to a very brief overview of your program statements. I looked at all the ones that have been submitted so far, and I generally like what I see. We'll talk about that for a minute. Then we're going to do a little lecture on thinking about theme creation and the kinds of practices that we would use in order to be successful with that. And then we'll talk about site analysis and functional diagramming. Then we'll go into our studio session and we'll show you some exercises there. So before I get started with going over our homework reviews, are there any questions off the top for the good of the order? All right, then let's go ahead and take a look at some of your homework assignments. Not that one, not that one. Where is that screen? Hold on a second. Yep, there it is. Should be right there. Ah, no. All right, hold on. Let's change our screens here. Don't know why it's being difficult. Okay. There we go. All right. So let's take a look at a few program statements. I'm going to talk about format and length right now, as I have not had an opportunity to review them for content, which will be the main topics that I'll be grading on would be format and content. So thinking about format in an example like this, blocking out by paragraph with headings, having a title at the top is really helpful to keep your documents organized while moving through the process, including a date, which is really important when it comes to documenting process. It's important to know when that document was created, because especially with things like program statements where the client may add items to their wish list, it'd be important to know when that item was incorporated into the project. So date, title, and organization that is readable and makes sense. Here's another one: date, title, the client, the objective, the scope of work, and the program statement, what they're looking to do, water management, outdoor entertaining, materials, cohesive design, so forth and so on. Very readable. This can work very nicely as in a checklist kind of a format, which I personally find to be very helpful when moving through the process. This one would have benefited from a title and a date, so perhaps including something like that. Take a look at just a few more. This is a simple one. Again, title and date would be helpful in keeping this document organized. I think there was one here towards the end, which I thought had some very attractive formatting. It might be this one. I like the way that the fonts were used for organizing for the client and family and the site and the scope of work. So that read very nicely. Lengthwise, I think all of you really kind of hit the sweet spot. About a page worth of information, a page and a half or a page and a quarter is good for a project of this size. I think that's a realistic amount of text to include for capturing the project. So overall, from first glance, these all look to be good. I'm going to be looking for some of those key items that were revealed in the interview process. So do keep that in mind. That will be looking for some specific things. And if I don't see them in your program statement, I'll point that out. All right, any questions about those? That was pretty simple. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be designing for theme, because that was one of the things that you were asked to do, was to create or establish a theme for your garden. Let's talk about that. Here we go. So all of these things we're going to talk about in more depth later on in the course, but I wanted to introduce them to you this evening because we're going to start doing some actual creative things and creating what's called a functional diagram. And it'd be helpful to have some of these design principles in your head when we're doing so. So in my opinion, the way to create a compelling and engaging theme starts with these principles. So let's want to briefly go over what they are and how we're going to put them into action with a couple of case examples. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So the first technique that we're going to be using is something called a narrative, creating a short story that describes what your garden is all about. The basis of this, and the reason why I put some emphasis on this, is that if you can't describe the garden that you want to create in words, then you won't be able to draw the garden. So if you're able to articulate it like a story, to make a statement about it, like here's what it is, here's why it's important, or if you're going to define a collection of things. Here's a collection of the things that we love. It's statuary, or it's plants, or it's some other objects that are important to you, or they satisfy a want or a need. We have a driving desire for a certain operation, a certain activity. We have a problem, it's a bad view, or we have a drainage problem. Maybe all these things are starting to sound a little bit familiar. We'll describe them in this narrative, but we're going to do it in a very simple way. We're going to keep it very short, like a couple of paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs. So here's a narrative that I created for a garden in the recent past. And I don't want you to read this whole thing, but I'm going to quickly talk through it and put some emphasis on the words that are important about it and what a narrative should sound like. Then you can go back into this video and we can talk about it again. But in the narrative, this is Beth and John's home. It was built in 1959 near Wilmington, Delaware. They highly value the architectural aesthetic of the home, but they have difficulty with parking and front door access, poor drainage, and lack of garden maintenance. It limits their enjoyment. The garden should be a respite for the owners. We envision clipped hedges and shade trees. We envision bubbling fountains and broad geometric forms that are evocative of the house. We envision patios and low stone walls offering spaces for outdoor cooking and dining. The experiences will enhance the amount and usability of the outdoor spaces and increase the owner's enjoyment. This is what a narrative should sound like. It doesn't get down into the fine details as to what those plants are, or exactly how we're going to do all those things. Rather, it paints a broad picture as to what we envision, the idea that we have in our mind. And we'll talk about this more as to where some of these ideas come from. We're also going to talk about order. How do we organize the space? Order helps us to document, study, and analyze the space for specific uses. We're looking for opportunities and challenges. Where are they located? How might they intersect with the things that we want to do or introduce into the landscape? Order will help us to define a generalized solution to the qualities that fit the language. We'll assign length and width and height to these solutions, and then arrange those solutions on the site using documented site analysis, which is going to be a focus for us today. So creating some organization to the space, some organizational logic. How will we arrange it? Will we arrange it around, view lines coming from the property? Will we arrange it through axes that are along walkways that we are creating, or maybe ones that are already there? How will we organize the space? Which elements will we use to organize that space? And again, I'm just trying to introduce you to some principles that are going to help us to establish theme. So based on that sketch that we did, trying to establish some order to the site, we came up with this particular plan. We'll show this project in a little more detail, what it looked like when it was finished in just a moment. We also want to try and create unity in the landscape. And again, we'll talk about these things later on in the course, not this week, but especially through creating things like focal point or dominant elements that help to organize the space, by repeating elements that help to connect one space to another, or one end of a space to the other end of the space, or by interconnection, that overlapping or enfolding or snapping together of spaces to make them feel like they're locked into one another, stacked almost like bricks might be in a wall or puzzle pieces. So creating focal point with something like, say, this fountain feature in the center, creating repetition by the fountain's new, or creating repetition by repeating the same kind of stone type and pattern in the fountain as is in the wall, or interconnection, overlaying the layers of trees and shrubs and ground covers and lawn into stacked layers that are in our particular view pane. The only way that these things are successful is if we know where the garden visitor is going to be. And that's the great thing about design, and what we're going to see in functional diagramming today is that by understanding where the space is and where the viewer might be standing in a particular location and looking in a certain direction, we know exactly what they'll be seeing. We'll explore that today. We'll think about mystery and legibility, hiding portions of the garden to create mystery or revealing parts of it to make it legible. We can understand that if there's too much mystery, the garden can be discouraging or forbidding. Too much legibility, and it becomes boring. There's not enough for us to explore. So we'll be thinking about ways to add these elements into the landscape. So in an image like this, perhaps hiding portions of the garden, creating mystery. What's behind these trees? There's tall shrubs over here, but I'm getting glimpses of things happening over there. Revealing portions makes things legible. This is a very clear and open space here in the center. There's features here that make me think that I am supposed to go this way, marking the entrance with pillars, lining the edges with shrubs, keeping your view lines clear so there's no obstructions to get us to where we want to go. Similar to mystery and legibility is complexity and simplicity. How many different or unique objects are in the landscape? The more that we have, the more complex the landscape feels. The fewer number of unique items or objects, plants, elements, furniture, construction, not enough, it's too simple. If there's too many, things are busy and confusing. If there's not enough, then it looks sparse or incomplete. So finding a balance between complexity and simplicity can be really important. So here, thinking about having just enough to make this space interesting. Furniture, textiles, containers, some plants, variety of those, but just enough simplicity. Repeating of the elements, blue stone on the wall, blue stone on the patio, wide open, clear, legible spaces makes this feel simple, yet just a little bit of complexity to make it interesting. Let me show you a few examples of how we have used some of these elements to establish a theme for each of these gardens. And these theme names I came up with that are maybe a little bit corny, but they are like working titles. And I encourage you, as you're thinking about a good theme that would work for the Murphy residents, a working title for your garden. So for this one, we came up with the idea of lap pool in a meadow, because the owner had two really simple requests. They wanted to keep the need for mowed grass to an absolute minimum, and they wanted to create a lap pool so the owner and her family could use it for exercise and recreation. Those were the two requests of this particular project, and virtually no others. So an introduction to the project. It's a relatively new subdivision home built in a farm that was sold and turned into, I think, about a dozen or so homes. Not particularly large homes, a pretty typical 2-garage, 4-bedroom modern home on a property that's a little bit less than an acre. You can see the neighbors are nearby. The lots are relatively small and somewhat irregular in shape, especially this one. This silt fence in the foreground represents a location just about on the property line. So there isn't a lot of backyard in this particular property, and there's lots of sloping. So as we were thinking about what this might look like, I was thinking, well, what does it look like to have a lap pool in a weird shaped lot and not having any lawn? And one of the things that I thought would be intriguing was that if we used this open space that was on the opposite, this is the community open space on the other side of that silt fence that I showed you. It was maintained like a meadow, native grasses and perennials. It looked very wild. So we thought, why don't we consider a garden that looks kind of wild, just like the common ground, and maybe that would actually make our property look bigger. So we explored that notion, thinking about certain viewpoints in the garden. One of the other requests that the owner had was to have a little sitting area where she could go and have a cup of tea and read a book and have some solitude, a little bit of quiet space. So we thought about those things, where they would be. In our concept sketch, we thought about where the pool might be and where planting beds might go, creating these gravel areas where we would use them for runoff and stormwater management, which was important because of the sloping ground, lots of water coming through the property, and sought to organize the space using this high-level concept sketch. By the way, this is similar to what your first pass at a concept might look like. So then the final garden looks something like this, where we really embrace the notion of using lots of perennials and some native shrubs, things that looked natural or natural-esque. They're not all native, but a lot of them are. We still wanted it to be garden-like, so we did that. Thinking about the combinations of plants and not being concerned about their species so much here, but thinking about what they did in certain seasons. One part of the garden emphasized blues and reds and creams and whites, whereas other parts of the garden emphasized golds or saturated greens or chartreuse. So we thought about how color could organize a space and give it different subsets to the overall theme. If we just did one big meadow in the entire garden, that feels a little bit boring. It's a little bit too simple. We wanted things to be a little bit more complex. So we looked at the site and thought about some different cultural combinations or cultural conditions that were there. And we thought, well, we can do different plant groupings and we can organize them by color, which is what we did. So in the front, we did some cool colors. As we moved around to the side, we emphasized metallic colors, the golds, the chartreuses, the yellows. And then as we got into the backyard, we got a little bit more colorful, looking at reds and oranges. We thought about the way that wind would move across the foliage of some of these grasses, about how people would walk through the space using naturalistic materials rather than heavy constructed stairs and such. Then you get a glimpse of the pool. Notice how a little bit of mystery over there. It makes you think, oh, is there something happening without actually seeing the whole thing? Then interestingly enough, if you just make a left turn and walk a little bit forward, the pool actually disappears behind these shrubs and you get a view of the meadow beyond, which is the common ground. Layers of plants. We wanted to make this something that wasn't difficult to maintain. So we used lots of repetition in the plants, which also helped to unify the garden. Here's another view of the pool and the pool from another side. So again, we really try to satisfy the request of the owner to have as little lawn as possible. So the little bits of lawn that we do have are serving more like paths or access ways in order to maintain or circulate around the property rather than being open recreation spaces, which you really couldn't do much of that anyway, except for the front yard. And because the owner's children were older, the need for things like swing sets or other things weren't as necessary. Backyard activities were eschewed for organized sports at school, so it wasn't really necessary for those things to happen here. So we're able to take away some of that lawn space and use it for garden creation. And thinking about the seasonality, what looks like different times of the year. Even plants that are going dormant still can look interesting. So there it is, let pool in a meadow. So here's another example. These are the student exhibition gardens at Longwood. These are some gardens that were created a number of years ago. The theme was actually given to the students here, and they needed to create gardens that matched the theme. Here, the theme was selected as Every Place Tells a Story. An example that I want to show here is how important focal point is in the garden. Notice this this arc type structure in the back behind Tim here. And Tim had this notion that he wanted to create a garden where the story was actually the people who visited it. And he wanted to encourage people to enter the garden and to take selfies in the garden space. So he created this space that encouraged people to do so by creating this vanishing point coming into the garden. They were able to create a sense of mystery, a little bit of enticement there that made people want to go in, but enough legibility to make it interesting and to create a dominant element, a focal point that would keep people's attention there. And just to prove my point as to how important that structure is as a focal point, imagine if that structure was not there. What might this look like? And how long might you continue looking at this garden? As lovely as it is, and for all the different plants that are in here, if the focal point wasn't there, how interesting is it? It's interesting. It's nice plants. You might see some favorites in there, but are you likely to stand there and look at it for very long? If you weren't interested in the plants, probably not. But if that focal point's there, probably so. So think about how important a focal point, a dominant feature in the landscape might be. Some other examples in the same exhibit time. The theme of this garden was, what was the name of their? I'm not sure if I had a name. I think they called this Flaming Cactus, and they were inspired by an art installation that they saw in Cooper Square in New York City a number of years ago, where the artist decorated all of the signposts and lamp posts and poles with colorful zip ties and did them in different patterns all up and down those structures, using everyday features as a support feature for their art. So the students here were inspired by that flaming cactus, and they wanted to create a garden that featured those things. So their theme was centered around flaming cactus. So their idea was to arrange these zip ties along these very simple metal cage structures, and then plant them with very whimsical fantasyland kind of plantings, almost an Alice in Wonderland kind of an experience with checkerboard walkways and saturated colorful plants that would play off of the whimsy of those colorful zip ties. So as what might be at first seem like a very pedestrian, everyday kind of item as a zip tie, by using them in unusual ways, we can establish this flaming cactus theme. Here's another theme that was embraced by Christine Varga here on your right and Nate Townsend on the left. So the theme that Christine was embracing was the notion of seeds and their use in the landscape. And she wanted to explore that by how seeds could be used for dyeing fabrics. Wonder where that idea came from, or vice versa. So She wanted to explore that and how different seeds or plant parts could be used to create fabrics. And she worked with a textile artist that gave her advice on which kinds of species were interesting for that. She had this notion of creating these structures that would hold fabric banners across the top that would flutter in the wind, and they'd be dyed at different points of saturation and color. So she imagined what these would look like. We did some exploration as to how tall they would need to be in order for a person to walk underneath them and not get smacked in the head by the fabric. So we did a little bit of working out on the drawings. We'll talk about looking at drawings in elevation view, which is what this is, a little bit later. But know that we also need to consider how tall things are to think about how they're going to look when we're viewing through them. Are things so tall that we can't see past them? Or are they just tall enough that we can't move through them? Or are they so low that we could step over them? And what are they going to do to our interaction and experience with the space? And here's what they looked like when they were finished. And then one other was this garden in the front right here called Line Transect. This is also using the notion of seeds in the landscape. And Meredith Mitchell over here and Cody Caparasso came up with the notion of a nature inventory process called line transect, where you draw a line through nature and then count the number of species population that intersected with that line to document an understanding of the population size of animals or insects or plants or other objects in the landscape. So they thought that was a really interesting notion of plant exploration. So they thought about the line transecting not as a string or something boring like that, but rather as a bold architectural gesture through the landscape. So they created this line using a simple wooden beam that they sheathed in metal to make it smooth and shiny, and then painted it a bright red color to make it really interesting, and then populated it with meadow-style plantings to create a contrasting backdrop to play the plants off of. And here's another one that thought about plants in an urban setting. Here, Alex Correa on the left and Lana Guardo on the right. We're thinking about how those plants that you might see growing out of a flat rooftop or out of your gutter or out of a crack in the sidewalk could actually be beautiful. So this is how ruderal or self-sowing plants can naturalize in an urban environment and what they might look like. So they thought about the decaying walls that you might see in an abandoned lot, the gravelly surface that you might see there for something that's been neglected for a long time. And then thought about the kinds of plants that you might see there. Things like rus, the staghorn sumac, or the paulownia tree, a fast-growing, almost weed-like tree that can get up to 20 feet tall in a single growing season. So they embrace those kinds of plants that many of us would dismiss as a roadside weed and say, no, they actually have beauty and value. So they thought about this garden, and the title for their garden was Seeds the City Chose. So you see how we might explore these notions of things that are interesting to us as designers. Pardon my, I think my mailman's coming, and someone's walking the dog out by making my dogs bark. So has something that's interesting to us or something that we want to explore further can fit in with something that's very garden-esque, right? It doesn't need to be just a garden. It can be something that we think is interesting to be used as a garden. Then we can share that with other people and make them want to enjoy it as well. All right. So there's some thoughts on using certain design elements as theme, and we'll go over those things in the coming weeks. But I want you to be just briefly introduced to those topics as we go into our next portion of the design process. And that portion next is going to be the idea of site analysis and then functional diagramming. So let's talk about that. Any questions before I move on?
I just have a quick one regarding the focal point. Could a
Yes.
patio itself be a focal point
A
if the
patio
garden is
is,
small?
yeah, you know, the patio itself might be a focal point, but the thing that typically makes focal point and actually makes us want to use it is the notion of dominance, meaning that the element is so unique or dissimilar to everything else in the landscape. And granted, if all you have is a house and a bunch of plants, then the patio might be just enough to be a focal point. But it may not be enough just to be different. It also needs to kind of almost overpower the site to a degree. And since patios are flat on the ground, maybe not quite overpowering enough. But if we ornament it enough and we create something fanciful like pavement or color or something else, then maybe it does become a focal point. Good question, though. Any others before I move on? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about site analysis. So we've already gone through the process of creating our base drawing. We understand where the property lines are. We know where the building is, pavements, other things, existing trees and such. I want to take a moment to also point out some things that aren't necessarily in the base drawing for our project, but might come up in other situations. And this is lightly addressed in our project. The idea of the right of way or setbacks. Keep in mind that oftentimes there are portions of the landscape which, while they appear to be ours visually and may even be our responsibility to maintain as part of our property maintenance, our typical property maintenance, that other owners, other entities may have some legal claim to it, such as whomever operates the roadway in front of your house. It might be a locally owned road, such as your town or county, or it might be a state or interstate federally owned roadway. And there's some portion of the land between the pavement and this line, an invisible line called the right of way, where that roadway owner lays claim. And this might be a space they might use for potential future expansion or for places for putting signs or drainage or utilities or other things. So you may be limited in what you are allowed to do in that location. Likewise, you might have other kinds of legal covenants restricting your property use. That might be access way for drainage or utilities, or it might be an occasional maintenance access for, let's say there's a property locked lot behind your land that's just a woodland or an open field or something that might need to be cared for from time to time because it's a state park or something like that. There may be some access ways that are on your property. So in your due diligence for researching a property, do check your home ownership papers, your deed or other documents that you may have, such as surveys that would indicate the presence of any easements or covenants on your property. You can also contact your local roadmaster to see what the width of the right-of-way is in front of your house and see how much of that land might actually be operated or owned by the authority having jurisdiction over the property. Yep. Some of the other things do show on our drawings, such as utilities. However, in our case, those utilities are overhead. Keep in mind that some utilities may be underground. So oftentimes the only kind of evidence that we have of underground utilities might be the presence of a wellhead or an electrical transformer or the cable TV pedestals or other things. And then the location of the utilities underground may not be visible to us. So it'll be our responsibility to understand where they are before we start digging. Likewise, if you're in a rural or semi-rural location, you may have something like an underground septic field for waste disposal. So you'll need to know where they are because there are limitations as to what you can do with the property over top of them. So before you do any digging at all on the property, and it's necessary for you to contact star 811 or call before you dig to make the correct local phone call for locating underground utilities. In most residential applications, it would be a good idea to call at some point during the design process, and there is actually a process for design phase. There's also a process for construction phase. However you do it, you can check out the 811 call before you dig website for more information. You can understand what kinds of services are available to you. The nice thing about it is if you're doing this for your own project or for you at home, it's a free service for you if you're the one doing the digging. The service and its operation is paid for by annual fees paid by operators, excavators, landscapers, and other companies that do work outdoors that pay an annual fee to keep this system operating. So if you are a professional and you're doing this for someone other than your own property, then you would have to be a member of the local utility locating authority. So it's very important that we understand where those utilities are and we document them on our base plan. So once we know where everything is, then we would take this information out into the field and do some studying to understand what's happening culturally or from a use standpoint on the property. And the kinds of things that we typically analyze in a landscape would be like the things that you see here: slope, soil, sun, circulation, and views. Especially things like slope. How does the ground move up and down? Is it flat? Is it gently sloping? Is it very steep? The way that the ground lays has a lot to do with the practical use of the landscape. Flatter ground is more practical for doing things like human use activities like patios or vegetable gardening. Whereas steep areas, we tend to try and stay off of them or try not to develop built things on top of them because either A, it's not allowed because of local codes, or B, it's just impractical to make them level without spending tremendous amounts of money on grading or retaining walls or other things to make them usable for human occupation. So having an understanding of where the slopes are can be really important as to how we organize our space and where certain things go. When it comes to soil, generally speaking, on one property, you probably have all of one kind of soil. If you're anywhere here, like in southeastern Pennsylvania, you probably have lots of heavy clay soils, whereas if you get closer to the coast, you're working with sandy soils, or in more upland areas where erosion has not caused any exposure of rock. You might have some nice silty loams or rich, fertile garden type soils. Knowing what you have, either by visual inspection, by actually digging a little test pit and seeing what's there, or taking a soil sample and sending it off to your state extension service and having it analyzed for particle type, pH, fertility is an important step in understanding our property and mapping it out. An interesting project I had was a woodland garden where the owners wanted to grow blue hydrangeas, but I knew that the soil was probably going to be very low in pH or high in pH, which would be the opposite of what we needed. So we took soil samples in various areas across the property to see if any of those spaces were better suited for that particular activity, which it turned out that it was. Also think about circulation.
Do you
Where are people?
generally take soil samples on all of your jobs or
Not
just
on all of them. Just when I know that certain things, like if I know that they want to do a vegetable garden, or if I know that she wants, if the owner wants to her hydrangeas to be blue and not pink, I know that I need certain pH in order for that to happen. So if I suspect that we may or may not have those conditions, I will absolutely take a soil sample to make sure that we have the proper growing conditions and where they are on the property. At
thank you.
minimum, I'll do a little bit of probing with my garden spade just to see the kind of soil, do a little excavation. And is it hard soil? Is it compacted? Is it rich and loose and loamy? Or what am I working with to make this a successful gardening activity? Good question.
Thank you.
So thinking about circulation, where will people be? Where will vehicles be? Where might we want to make sure that we're having clear access? Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. So knowing that we have doorways here and here going through, that we have vehicular traffic, which is, I think, pretty obvious going straight up the driveway, but being clear about that. We might also think about lawnmower access. Do we need to create a path to make sure that we can have our lawnmowers getting through, at least 6 feet wide for most commercial mowing decks? So where will people be going? Where will the equipment be going? Do we need to keep those ways clear? Are we seeing any opportunities for making better circulation patterns to make things more efficient? And then finally, things like views. Where will people be standing in the landscape, and in which directions do we have things that are desirable versus things that maybe are not quite so? I've developed a little, again, I've developed a symbol library of my own that helps you understand if a person's standing here and looking in this direction. I'll put a broad arrowhead on here, and I use that as my good view symbol. And I might make a note to myself that there's nice views. Where I put the arrow has a lot to do with where that view might be. If it's in the foreground, I might draw that arrow to that particular location. But if it's off in the distance and off of our property, I might draw it to the location of where it is. Similarly, if I have a bad view to my neighbor's property over here, I put a little squiggle in the middle of that and note that as a bad view of the neighbor's garage. I might even note where better angles for viewing the house might be. If I'm standing on the sidewalk and looking across the angle here, this might be a good place for setting up a particular view line up to the house.
And how do you like to differentiate which pieces of information on this page for the site analysis goes on the program statement versus in future design work, like what we're about to do?
It's like, so comparing this to like, in which this obviously is a different project than our example project for the class. Typically there's probably one or two things that the client will call out specifically that are really important to them, like an area of bad drainage or a bad view. So we'll include those in written form in the program statement as an objective to achieving their goal. What this process does is seeks to round out a more complete picture of where other things on the property that the client may not know about or doesn't even know that they care about just yet, right? Things that are important to the use of the property that we know from our experience in the landscape that are going to be important for the successful application of a garden solution. So all of this information is actually, we would typically seek this after we prepare the program statement because that sets up our project. And then the client says, yes, I agree with your process and this program statement, let's move forward. So this process happens after the program statement. That makes sense?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So the takeaway here for this process is that it's important to map out where these things are happening on the property, because this lends to how the property can be used most successfully. If there's flat land here, it's important that we know that. So maybe we can do certain things on flat land versus on sloping land. If I have a good view over here, I want to do everything that I can to preserve that and turn people's attention away from the bad view over there. If we don't map it out and know where it is on the property, then we're less likely to be successful in organizing our spaces in the landscape, which is the next step. So a few examples of what site analysis might look like. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing on this one. These are good ones, but I've got some other examples that I want to share with you.
And while you're pulling that up, is this also time when you would look at the impervious surface?
Yes, if we are concerned with impervious cover, which I'm almost always concerned about impervious cover now because every municipality in Pennsylvania has legislation that governs it, then yes, I would be documenting impervious cover if that's within my scope. If not, I'll be hiring a civil engineer to do that mapping to help me understand where that's happening. Yes.
Okay.
So here's some examples of some recent projects that we did that show how we do site inventory and analysis. So in this property, it's a relatively small property, less than a quarter acre. We used a combination of aerial photography that we got for free off the internet, architectural drawings that were prepared by the architect for the renovation of the house, and a survey that was prepared by a civil engineer. So it gave us a pretty high level of accurate information that we were able to use. And the things that we're documenting here are existing natural features, such as existing trees that would need to remain, bad views that the owner wants to mitigate, and then slope and water runoff as it's working across the property. So looking here at this high level view, and by using the aerial photograph, we're able to easily document trees that aren't even on our property. We didn't have a survey of the neighbors' properties, but we made some assumptions as to where the trees were based on the canopy that we could see. And we drew circles around those existing trees because they definitely were something visible to our client, even though they weren't on our property, especially this one down here in the lower left corner of their property. That tree looks, for all intents and purposes, like it's on their property, even though the center line is on the neighbor's property. And others like this big one here and this big one over here. So we wanted to make be very careful about knowing where they were because they would influence how we use the land. Having an aerial photography underlayment to the base drawing helps us understand where the neighbors' houses are without having to actually draw them. So it gives us a good understanding of our proximity to our neighbors. So this property is very much like the one that we're working on. However, unlike the property that we are working on, this property has a little more change in slope than what we have. So we used a technique for mapping slope here that used lighter colors for flat ground and darker colors for sloping ground. So the light green and medium green in the front yard are pretty flat. We have a legend here off to the side that documents what those slopes are. The light and medium green are less than 5% or between 5 and 10%. And to put that into perspective, less than 5% slope is considered to be a sloping pathway that would be accessible under the definition of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So less than 5%, for all intents and purposes in the landscape, I would consider to be flat. Between 5 and 10, most people and equipment can move across a 5 to 10% sloping area with little difficulty. You can move yourself or wheelbarrows or safely mow grass using a push mower or a riding mower there. But once we get into steeper, like 15 or even 20% or more, which are indicated by this dark green, this is 20% or more. It really is steeply sloping to the point where we would need to do some considerable regrading or building a retaining wall to make some flatter ground in order to make it usable. So we use this to map out where the flat ground is and where the sloping ground is. And while dealing with severe grade changes is slightly beyond the scope of this activity, there are some spots in our garden that we're going to point out that have slightly different sloping characteristics that you should be aware of. So that's what we did here, is to show the client these areas in the front are flat and these areas in the back are sloping. So one of the first conversations we had was, well, were you expecting to have a place for the kids and grandkids to like play catch or play sports in the backyard? Because if you are, then we need to think about using some of the land around the edges. The problem was, and we noted here, is that there's an area of water movement right through here, which we call a swale. So we realized that even though it is flat, every time it rains, water is going to run through there and probably remain for some time. So even though it is flat, it's probably going to also be wet. So it's not going to be very usable. So the results of this exercise led us to the understanding that if we're going to create some usable active recreation space, it's probably going to have to be in the front yard. See how we did that? Right. Likewise, looking at negative views in the landscape, the owners wanted to create some distance between them and their neighbors, especially like their neighbor's swimming pool back here or the neighbor's deck over here, which felt very cluttered and disorganized to them. So they wanted to reduce their views there. And we might be successful with doing that by, say, maybe adding some screen trees here. And we included these screen trees because they were actually required by the municipality where this is located. So we needed to make sure we had enough room for those in the landscape because we didn't have a choice. They had to be there. So we had to think about other ways of blocking these views from other directions. So that's one way of documenting a site. Other things that we might document, this is a slightly larger property, well, much larger, this is like 4 acres. So we documented not only the slopes like you see in the upper left-hand corner and the view sheds like you see in the right, but we also documented areas of open planting and forested or woodland areas. So in this drawing, we made a very clear distinction about locations that have a dense forest canopy to them versus those areas that are open in lawn space, which are the white areas in the middle. So in thinking about where those kinds of cultural conditions are, we wanted to make sure that we knew, well, where do we have sun, where do we have shade, and what kind of activities might be best suited for those kinds of locations. So we organized those things and understood where those were. We even added some information about what kind of species were there, such as pine tree canopy or black walnut canopy, knowing that, say, for instance, black walnut can be very territorial in allowing other species of plants to grow within their root zone through the release of a substance called juglione. So we knew that certain species weren't going to grow underneath those trees, so we were careful to document those in our site analysis. And there's some other things that we might be interested in are things like circulation. Here we're thinking about a wooded site for this owner, and we put this blue swirling line here to show where a convenient path might be through this wooded area. And we determined those paths to avoid areas of steep slope, which are represented by the darker shaded areas, or areas that might be crossing a swale, such as these stream areas through here or up through the top. We also were documenting the paths of things like vehicles. Just keep in mind, and again, slightly beyond the scope of this class, but think about what it takes for certain vehicles to maneuver on a property. This garage here was being added by the architects to the house over here, and it was our job to figure out how the cars are going to get to the garage that the architects were designing. So we drew these dashed lines that were representative of the turning radius of the cars to understand where the wheels would be tracking relative to the pavement or other obstacles that might exist. And we came to the conclusion that while these two car bays were more or less in the clear, this third car bay would actually need more room to maneuver than was currently available based on the location of this existing retaining wall and existing trees in the property that would even have to track well off of the pavement in order to get there. So understanding where those things are in the landscape and mapping them out and document them is extremely important for the successful arrangement of space in our landscape. So we're going to take a short break now. When we get back, I'm going to talk a little bit about functional diagramming and how that might work after we do a little exercise as to what that might look like on our base drawings. So let's take a break. We're at 3 minutes before the hour. Let's take a break until 10 minutes after the hour and we'll reconvene. See you soon. Okay, welcome back. So let's take a look at how site analysis might be applied to our particular projects. I'm going to switch over to my desk camera and we'll go through an exercise. Yes, we have to mirror that view. Hold on one second. Or unmirror, I should say. There we go. Okay. So looking at our base drawing, we're going to set another layer of trace over top of our base drawing. Remember that when we work in the design process, we often work in each step in the process as a layer because each step builds upon the other. The base drawing documents the existing physical conditions of the property. And now we're going to map out what those conditions and other things that we might observe mean to us. I see Amanda. Is everyone seeing the video? Is everybody seeing my drawing? Yes. Okay. Okay. So because we're working in layers and because we may from time to time need to put our layer back on top of the drawings that we're using previously, it's important that we trace some easily recognizable features in the landscape so we can realign our layer with the other drawings. Usually, the most convenient object to trace is either the building or the property line. You get those things right and everything else pretty much falls into place. Okay. So thinking about those elements that of the landscape that we might be documenting, let's think about things like sun, for instance. So in order to understand sun, first we need to know where the sun is. So I'm going to go ahead and just trace over my north point, which is on the drawing here. North is at the top of the drawing. So that is north. So we know from our elementary school science class that the sun rises in the east and tracks across the sky in the southern hemisphere for us here in the United States, and then sets over here in the west. So that means that in the morning, sun is going to be casting in this direction. Any objects in its path will be casting shade over to the west, and then the opposite will be true in the afternoon. So we know that from our observing the site that we have some things on the property that show in the base plan that might cast shade, things like trees, for instance, trees. or buildings. But also keep in mind that from other information that we got about the site, from aerial photography of the neighborhood level, that there are also trees on the neighboring property that don't show up on our drawing, but they are in fact influencing what's happening on our property. So tracking or mapping out things like how far the shadows will go is literally a moving target, right? The shadows are in different places and in different lengths literally at every hour and every day of the year, all the time. They're constantly moving. So there are ways of modeling out the shade patterns at any particular moment in time. But for the sake of this exercise and other projects of this size, it's usually best to just make some generalizations. So for instance, we know that we have a few existing trees here and a rather large canopy of larger trees over here in the southeast corner. So if we think about that, and we can generalize and say that we would have shade in this portion of the property for some period of the day. And because we have these trees over here in the front yard, at various times of the day, we're going to have shade here. And then we might even think about the building casting some shadows in the afternoon. So maybe generally speaking, we have some shade here. That means in the areas that we have left are sun. Right? So we might do something that looks like that. So other things that are on the property that that might influence our enjoyment of it and that were brought up by the owner are view lines. So again, just like sun and shade, views are literally a moving target. Depending on where you are and in which direction your face is pointing, you're going to get a different kind of a view, aren't you? Right? So it's important that we make some assumptions, some generalizations about where people are going to be most often or most frequently in the house or around the landscape, and document those. So thinking about the uses that are within inside the house, the kitchen, the den, where we talked about the owner spending a lot of time, these were important places to them. So thinking about the kitchen, for instance, if we were standing here in the kitchen, there's a window. We might document, we know from aerial photography that there's a house over here in the neighboring property. And maybe we would do something like this. We have a bad view in that direction, but maybe from the kitchen and looking out, we might actually consider this to be a good view because the window and the position of the house frames the view directly into our landscape and doesn't we can't see the neighbors from there. Whereas, say for instance, if we were standing here at this window, there's a house over here.
What
Yeah,
does that little line break indicate?
Yeah, so this is the symbol that I use to differentiate between a bad view and a good view.
Okay,
The
got
little
it.
squiggly line means bad view, and no break means nice view.
Okay, cool, got it.
Yeah. We might think about similar things, like say from the sidewalk, we might be walking along and say, oh, you know what, the house looks fantastic. If I'm standing here and looking in that direction. So sun and shade, good view, bad view. So this might not be maybe all of that readable. So maybe we want to do some things to make it a little bit more appealing. So maybe we can use some color here. This is a instance where I like using chart pack markers rather than color pencils, because you see how quickly I can cover a lot of territory. And almost no matter how hard I press on this thing, which is not very hard, it always comes out the same darkness. Don't forget that that little corner is part of our property. It's there. We might do that. And if you're really feeling ambitious, maybe we color in the sun, the sunny locations. Then when it comes, so since these areas are labeled sun and shade, that is easily understandable. But because those arrows are not necessarily understandable, we would need to do one of two things. We would either need to label it good view, bad view. And we might even offer some additional information as to what that bad view might be. The other thing that we could do is create a symbol legend in the margins where we do a recreation of that symbol and then put a label next to it to indicate what that symbol means. Either way is acceptable. It really comes down to preference and what kind of aesthetics you like to establish, and then act accordingly. So there's a few things. Now, thinking about the legibility of our drawings, there's some other things that we probably would want to document, specifically maybe things like circulation and topography, right? But I'm thinking that the more lines I put on this particular drawing, the less readable it's going to be. So I'm going to put a title. We'll do solar and view analysis. And today's date is 9/23/25. At minimum, this would be how we would label or title our sheet, so we know what we're looking at. You might also want to put the client name on there and maybe the initials of the person who drew it if there's multiple people working on the project. So if I did that, I'm going to set that aside. Now, do a quick trace so I can realign my drawing when the time comes. All right. I've outlined that. So now let's think about things like circulation and slope. So thinking about how we might move through the landscape, I find it very helpful to graphically understand where people have a tendency to move or need to move. That way, we're less likely to put an obstacle in the way of where people go. It also helps us to analyze where we might have higher concentrations of circulation that might wind up being difficult to manage in the landscape. Like for instance, like starting to look at something like this. I've got 3 doors all coming out into one space. Think about rooms inside your house. The more doors you have in a room, think about how difficult it can be to, like, say, place furniture in there, right? Because you need to keep those areas clear for people to move around. So understanding where motion happens can be really important. Thinking about, things like getting into the backyard. Not to say that in open areas like the side yards that we can't change that. Just different than the location of a doorway, isn't it? Right? But at least knowing that at present we have circulation there, and maybe we do or maybe we do not keep that circulation happening. We have a depressed curb here leading into the driveway. That's a way to get into the side yard. So various things happening there. So looking for concentrations of space, notice how more arrows here. Notice like we're starting to see a lot of congestion here, right? Whereas these areas without circulation patterns, right? Very open. Do you see that? Right. So thinking about where people are moving because the architecture has set us up for that type of a situation. All right. So when it comes to topography, again, I intentionally chose a property that has very little change in slope just to make things easier for us in the design process, right? I don't make it too impossible for you. So remember how I told you that the contour lines give us indication of the that point on the land relative to a certain benchmark. Here, the example is a project benchmark. It's an assumed benchmark of 100 feet. So it's labeled here. There's 97 feet running through here. There's 98. Then there's 99. So from the front yard all the way to the backyard, there's only 2 feet of grade change, right? So if I just do an anecdotal analysis here, the percent slope of that 2-foot grade change from here to here over an 84-foot distance, I can quickly do some math here. So the change in height from 97 to 99 is 2 feet, right? So 2 feet divided by the distance horizontally, 84 feet, gives me a result of 0.023. If I multiply that by 100, I convert it to percentage. So that means I have a 2.38% slope, which is literally the barest of minimums that we would need based on our understanding that this is in tables that can be researched. That is the minimum slope that I would recommend for, say, a pavement to drain properly. About 2% actually is a good slope, because water will move across 2%, but visually the surface looks flat. So that's great for pavement. The problem here is that all of this happens to be soil. So water is moving very slowly across soil, and soil will absorb water. At least the soil here in our part of the world does. And to make matters worse, the high point and the low point is interrupted by a building. So somehow the water needs to get from a high point to a low point, get all the way around the building, which actually makes the distance longer, which actually makes the percent slope even flatter. So we know that we have a very flat site here, and that we probably have some situations. So one of the things that we can do to track the movement of water is to show where the water is traveling. And one of the things I told you is that that water will flow in a direction perpendicular to the line of the contours. So if we do some arrows here that are running perpendicular to the contour lines, we can start to get a better picture of where the water is going, because all the arrows are going to point to where it wants to go. Do you see where the water wants to go here? I literally drew an arrow to it, right? So we can keep going. So check this out. Where is the water going? Is it going to the street? No, it's not. It's going right there, right? That's why we have that wet spot there, right? Because the shape of the ground is driving it in that direction. We can continue doing that analysis. So a few things. Not only can we see which direction the water is flowing, which we can see in general, the water is going diagonally across the backyard here. And then over here on the other corner of the property, it's starting to head down towards the street. So everything from here down, that's probably fine. Over here, this is fine up here, but this is starting to be a problem. So we can see the direction of where the water is flowing. The other thing is, just like in our circulation patterns, the higher the density of these arrows, the steeper that area is going to be, isn't it? So if I look at the dense cluster of my arrows drawn here, I can see that I actually have a rather steep slope here, right? So I might draw a boundary around my densest cluster of arrows and realize that I have a steep area right here. But then everything, look at all the distance in between over here. Flat, 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 right? Steep, 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 flat, 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 right? So I can look at it that way. And maybe this is a readable enough drawing. Maybe I want to create some emphasis on my steep slopes. Steep slope, or steeper than anything else on the property. And because I have this concentration of arrows over here, that is, let's choose a different color. Let's do that. There we go. All right. You see what I did there? All right. Just by doing some graphic exercises, we can get an understanding for what's happening on the site, and I can look at all these things together if I'm so inclined, and then get an even clearer picture of what's happening. So if I have an area of wet sun, right? Or if I have an area of sloping shade, right? I have a wet full sun condition here. I have potentially dry full shade condition here, right? Because the ground is sloping, so the water's moving. that means that water's not sitting here. So I have dry soil, right? Dry soil in the shade, wet soil in the sun. But here, this is outside of the wet area. So here I have soils that are maybe average or reasonably well draining. They're in the sun, but it's kind of compressed by that wet area. Or maybe down in here, I've got full sun on flat ground and it's well drained. There's no, some of these things we can map out by seeing on what's on the drawings. Other things we might actually observe these on the property with our own eyes and realize, so we looked at the soil, it's always dry here. It's never been wet. We might have to ask questions of the client, right? So here we have average soil because it's flat in the shade. Here we have dry soil, flat in the sun, right? And so on, right? So you see how we can use this kind of mapping to help us better understand where certain things can be successful in the property. I'm not seeing anybody nodding their heads or smiling or anything, and I'm afraid that maybe I've lost you. Are you with me so far? Okay, thank you, Eva. You're making me feel better. All right, hold on one sec.
How do you understand which way the water flows?
If we have the benefit of a contour drawing, meaning a drawing that shows the direction, the elevation of the ground with these contour lines, which we've included in your drawing.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the benefit of that, then we know for a fact, because we've studied water, that water will always flow in a direction perpendicular to the line, right? But because the line changes direction, we need to pick a line that's 90 degrees at any given point. So I chose a certain cadence, if you will, around the property and just drew along those lines, and then drew a line perpendicular to that line at that given point. Does that make sense to you?
I think so.
Okay. I'm not sure I can do any better than that right now. Try it for yourself and see if you come up with something that looks like what I've done and see if it makes sense to you. Remember that if we have a line going in this direction, if I draw a line perpendicular to it, that's 90 degrees, right?
Right.
If they have a line that's going, if it changes direction here, well, I need to do it this way, right? If I have going this way and this way, and we're going downhill in that direction, then I'm going to draw a line that's going perpendicular to it like that. Right?
Oh, okay.
Right. Like that, like that, like that, like that.
Mhm.
You got it?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Clear as mud.
Hi,
Okay.
Dan.
Yes.
So you have the base plan at the bottom, and then you
Mhm.
have both of these two different types of mappings over
Mhm.
top of them.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
those mappings, that's what's considered like the functional diagramming you
This is
mentioned
not a
earlier?
functional diagram. This is called site analysis.
Okay.
Yep. So here we have slope and circulation analysis.
And what are the things that you notice in doing slope analysis that might trigger you to get outside consult on that?
Usually the intensity of the proposed work. If we know we're doing lots of pavements or buildings or other things that would require fairly intensive work with foundations or bases and things like that, you're immediately talking about a project that's going to be of some expense, right? Either because you're hiring somebody or because you're doing it yourself and it's going to take you a long time. So if we know we're building something and we need to make sure that water is flowing in the correct direction, make the investment and get a survey that shows the topography. If we're working with plants primarily, or incidental little pieces of walkway that don't need to be of a certain geometry and what have you, that could be responsive to highs and lows in the ground, then I would just go by visual observation, perhaps taking some on-site measurements using some rudimentary tools that would give us those measurements.
And is there ever a point well, I shouldn't say this. Do you find it pretty rare that you ever have to work with like some kind of hydrology expert in residential projects, or is that mostly like,
In most residential projects that are garden oriented, no.
okay.
If we're doing something that relates to construction, because we need to manage stormwater, and usually that means we're trying to put that water into the ground, then yes, we're dealing with soil scientists who are going to study the ability of the ground to absorb water and how quickly it does it, or how slowly it does it. And so we'll do that for stormwater management, or you'll need it for, like, say, an on-site septic field if there wasn't one already. Those kinds of things, right? So
Okay.
those are the only situations where we need to hire someone like that.
Okay.
So I would say the more complex and expensive the work, the build gets, the more likely it is you're going to have to engage in other professionals to get you the information that you need. But it becomes part of the, part of the expected expense of the project. Any other questions before I switch back to a lecture online? Then we're going to do some functional diagramming. Okay. Okay. I was just checking out your comments there. I think I've answered all of them so far. So one more thing we're going to talk about is functional diagramming. There we go. Okay. So what are we talking about here? Functional diagramming establishes a collective scope of work and associates approximate area requirements for each item or the spaces in the scope. So what does this mean? It means that for everything that we envision placing in the landscape, we're calling that thing a function, right? What is it? The function is a patio, or the function is a vegetable garden, or the function is a little outbuilding, or it's an active recreation space or something, right? Each of those things is something that the client wants or needs, or is a response to our understanding of the property in order to make a complete landscape. And all of those things has some requirement for space in order for it to work properly, right? So the first step is for us to prepare a list of functions that correlate to the program statement, right? We're going to talk about that. I'm going to walk you through an exercise and how that works. So once we've established that list, then each of those items is going to be graphically placed on a functional diagram layer and studied for its efficiency or its efficacy based on the results of our site analysis and their proximity to one another. So we have this function, this thing that the client wants or needs. We think about how big that space needs to be in order for it to be effective, establishing the length and the width of it. So for instance, we need a patio for 4 people for dining. We've determined through research or our own study that we need a 10 by 10 patio, right? So then we look for a location on the functional diagram that would be appropriate for outdoor dining, and that would be able to hold a 10 by 10 space. We go through that process for every element in our program, for all the spaces that we have envisioned for them, the function, right? Once we've arranged them on paper, then we're going to consider how people or vehicles will move either through those spaces or in between those spaces, right? How will we link them together? And then how will we see from one space to the next? So what are we talking about here? Well, here's a little practical exercise. We go through our program statement. We think about all the things that the client has asked us for. And this is a hypothetical. This is not our project. This is just hypothetical, but something that wouldn't be too unusual for a residential project. And let's say that the owner asked for a vegetable garden and a water feature and a shed and so forth and so on. So as we're going through that program, we're going to think about, well, what's the appropriate size for each of those things? And for something like a vegetable garden, for instance, how big is a vegetable garden supposed to be? Well, gosh, they could be a little 4-foot by 10-foot raised bed, or it could be a half an acre, right? So let's say we get to that point in the program and we read that they want a vegetable garden, but you know what? In the interview, I forgot to ask the client, well, how much vegetable gardening do you want to do? That would have been an appropriate question. So I may need to ask them that question now after the interview and say, you said you wanted a vegetable garden, but we didn't determine how much it is. What are we doing here? Is this just enough so you and the family can have some things to make a salad? Or are you thinking about having enough extra so your kids can run a little farm stand for the summer, right? What are we talking about here? How much size? And then base again on your experience or your research or other things that you would determine the appropriate size for the vegetable garden that the owner envisions. And so forth and so on through the rest of the exercise. They wanted a water feature. Well, what do you want to do with the water feature? Is this just for sound and motion, or do you want to raise fish, or do you want to be able to sit at the edge and put your feet into it? What is it supposed to do? The shed, what are you going to put in there? How much equipment, storage, other things? What's going to happen in there? How big is the patio or conversation space? Well, how many people? What kind of activities? And so forth and so on. So we go through that whole list of functions until we understand how big they need to be and then what their function is, and then consider the most appropriate place for those functions based on our site analysis. So take a look here for this this example functional diagram, and look at some of the spaces that we've created. For instance, we thought about the building, the rooms inside the building. The kitchen is here, the family room is here. We know that there is a doorway here. So in this functional diagram, we considered the grill to be just outside the door of the kitchen. That seems to make some sense, doesn't it? Right? We have the kitchen, that's kind of like where we keep all of our food and other things, and we can walk right out the door and then the grill would be there. That makes sense. So then the owner also asked for a patio for conversation and a patio for dining. So thinking about how we like to entertain in a flow of space, you might take some cues from architecture, take some cues from your house. What's the relationship of one space to the next in a house? If we have the kitchen, then we have the family room, and then we have the dining room, and those spaces have a certain flow to them. So how do we like to do it? So thinking about that, maybe we have a small patio space for dining and a bigger patio space or for conversation and a bigger patio space for dining. So we think about the best place for those. We might think about those being on a flat location so we can minimize the amount of grading that we have to do. And other things. Also looking at our site analysis, which I've omitted for clarity's sake here, but we also knew that out in here, we had some good views here and we had some bad views over here, didn't we? So we thought about that. It's like, okay, what if we had a screen here that blocked views of that bad view, and that we kind of turn people's heads and we had them looking out into this direction. And in order to not block their view into that nice portion, we're considering this space to be low, like say like a meadow or something like that. Maybe that was something that they had asked for, right? So it's important that we think about each of these spaces as a function, not what it is, but what's it doing for the owner? Why is this a benefit? Is something that they asked for, or it's helping to resolve a problem? but it can't be, so I actually didn't give enough information, something like, say, lawn, for instance. Well, that's really not a good function. Bad designer. So unless there was something in the program statement that says we want a lawn that is big enough to have the kids play, and maybe we can set up a tent or an awning for our annual family reunion. Just saying lawn is not a function, right? A lawn is just grass, right? What's the purpose for it? Why is it there? So we need to make sure that the things that we're showing in the landscape have a purpose for being there. All right. So let's go through a little exercise here. Okay, so going back to our drawing table, we have our site analysis. I'm going to go ahead and lay them all down. So we're looking at all of them, knowing full well that the more layers we have stacked upon one another, the more difficult it might be to read them, because that translucency of the paper only extends so far, right? But I understand that. We're going to try this for now. So now we'll lay out another piece of paper, another layer of trace. And I'm going to do this using the examples in my slide presentation. So I'm just going to, for clarity's sake, we needed a veg garden, about 12 by 16. We needed a water feature, about 8 by 8. And let's see. Well, so in my example, we wanted a shed, but we already have a shed, so I don't need to do another one. However, they wanted shed/storage. So we will list that, maybe 10 by 18, they said. And then patio for dining, 12 by 16, and then patio for conversation, 10 by 10. All right. That's what they asked for. Trace, so we can align again. And there we go. All right. So now, functional diagramming. Let's think about what they're asking for. Let's start with a vegetable garden, shall we? If you wanted to grow vegetables, what do you need?
Sun,
Sun. What else?
water, good soil.
Yeah, so
Flat.
having, say again?
Raised
Ladder
beds.
Maybe raised beds, maybe. So having water and having good soil are two different things, aren't they? Right? We need a certain amount of water, right? Do we need it wet all the time?
No.
No.
No. We need it to be wet for a little while, until the plants use it up, and then we want them to dry out for a little bit, and then repeat the cycle, right? So we need a certain amount of water. We need a controlled amount of water, don't we? Very good. So we need
good
sun.
drainage.
Exactly. Good drainage, good sun, good soil. So those are the things we need for a vegetable garden. And we think that we need it to be about 12 by 16 feet. So thinking about that, right off of the bat, based on our site analysis, where are we not going to put the vegetable garden?
In the shade.
In the shade, right? So we immediately take that one off of the board, don't we? Right?
In the wet spot.
And we're probably not going to put it in the wet spot, right? So we're not going to put it there. So it can't go here, it can't go there. This gets shady in the afternoon.
I beg to differ, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Because where the water collects, it can be remediated. And actually, this would be a perfect spot for the vegetable garden.
Okay, maybe it will be. Do we know how we're going to remediate this?
Increase drainage.
Yes, drainage pipes.
Okay. So, good question. So, in order for the drainage pipes to work, what do they need to do?
Dig.
Rain.
Someone said
You need
drain.
a trench. You need a trench that slopes a little, and the water collects towards the trench, and it's being carried to the street.
There you go. It needs to slope a little bit. You're right. That's right. It needs to slope actually a certain amount, doesn't it? Right. So again, beyond the scope of this, so I'm going to cut right to the chase, and I will peel this back so we can take some measurements, because I'm going to take one of your solutions right off the board for you here. So there's two ways that we can relieve a water problem. We can improve the ability of the ground to absorb water back into the surrounding area where it does no longer pools at the top, right? Or we can collect it and evacuate it from the area and send it someplace else, right? Those are really our only two choices.
Or create a bog if they want a water feature.
Okay, hold on a second, Eva. We're talking about vegetable gardens here, right? Let's just hold it. So I want to get to a point.
It could be next to the vegetable garden.
Okay, hold on a second, guys. Let me make my point. You guys are chomping at the bit. That's great. I'm glad.
With you.
Okay, good. So look at the information we're given. We're at 98 feet here. We're at 97 feet approximately at the street, right? So that means that somewhere about here we have 1 foot of change in about 60 feet. So 1 foot of change divided by 60 feet equals 0.016, and multiply that by 100, it gives us our percent slope, which is 1.6%, right? So what that means is that at 1.6%, water will not reliably flow across earth or vegetation, right? Because there's too much friction, right? In order for it to flow successfully across earth or plants, it needs to pitch at least 3 to 5% minimum, right? So 1.6 is fine if it's pavement, but it's not fine if it's plants. So the idea of creating, say, a low point here right off the bat doesn't work. The problem also being that in order to if we try to make this go steeper, what happens? We start going in lower and lower until we hit an immovable object, being the curb, right? That curve is not going to get any lower. So yes, we can make the ground go steeper and steeper and steeper downhill and make the water move away. But now we've just moved the drainage problem from here to there, which may not be a solution.
Because I understand the point. I understand the gravity and the physics behind it. But my question is there a possibility to essentially remediate the area and level it so there is no slope, so essentially level the backyard?
The only way that works is because the water is going to continue coming from the neighbors, whether we like it or not, right? So the water will still keep coming. So the only way for that to work is if the water can get collected and gets piped out someplace else and becomes part of a larger stormwater system within the town, within the town. But unfortunately, for most residential homeowners, that's not an option that's available to you. So what I'm telling you is this: you have a water problem here that will not go away. And I will let you in on this. This is an actual project with an actual situation for an actual client of mine. And we did explore the possibility of taking the water, collecting it, moving it over to here, where it may percolate down into the soil. But the solution was about $30,000. Right? So while it is actually technically possible, spending $30,000 just to make this dry didn't track well with the owners. Question?
Oh, yeah. Me or was somebody else about to ask something?
Sorry, was my dogs were barking. Hold on one second.
Oh,
Sorry. Okay. So I missed your comment there.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So where I live in New Jersey, there are all kinds of regulations that
Yes.
actually prevent homeowners from bringing their stormwater down into the municipal system.
Yes,
And,
that's correct.
and they're now required to accommodate stormwater on the property. So you,
Yes.
yeah.
That's true. That's pretty much true in just about every municipality. It's not just New Jersey. That's true here in Pennsylvania as well.
Right. So we wouldn't be able to bring it to the street anyway.
You would not. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's my point here. Go ahead. Yes, question.
sorry. I was just going to say, can you raise a portion of that? Was it 97, I think, right there where it gathers? So can you raise a portion of it from the south side, or at least looking at it from the, I think that's your south side.
You raise it here, then the
Right.
water just tries to get around it. So you just dam it up on this side. So now you've changed the wet spot from here to there.
Well, can you keep, as you raise it, as it heads from the south side to the north, can you add that pitch and then put like a rain garden or bog garden towards the north side? So that way,
There's a possibility.
okay.
Right? Yeah, so there's a possibility.
And what would
So
the cost be of that? I feel like that would be cheaper, right?
it probably would be. To create something of vegetated response rather than a
Mhm.
constructed response would most likely be less expensive. So here's my
Also,
point. Let's get back.
Mhm.
Let me get back. I need to make some other points here. So let's move on. Here's what I want you to know. You have a wet problem here that will either it's here or maybe we can do some grading. We can shift it to over here, but most likely we're not going to get it to go away, right? So we have this area of wet, occasionally moist, sometimes dried out completely, and occasionally flooded, right? That is always going to be somewhere in this proximity, and it's in full sun, right? That's what we have, right? So thinking about our vegetable garden here, if I was thinking about where a good place for a vegetable garden is, I would probably want it to be in full sun. I would maybe want it to be in well-drained soils that I have control over how much moisture it's receiving and when, and what other kinds of things might be in my rationale when thinking about where to put a vegetable garden.
Close to the kitchen.
Maybe close to the kitchen, make it convenient, right?
Access to a water source.
Access to a water source. Do I know where the water sources are in the house? No, I haven't plotted it out, so I don't know for sure, but yes, that would be a great thing to know. Maybe if I knew that there was a hose bib there, right? That might be handy to know, right?
Can I ask something?
Yes.
Could we convert the wet spot into a water source where it gets cycled? Like instead of just a bog garden, like turn it into a bog filter pond type thing where you have a resource that you can tap into and water it whenever you want?
Or even
Like
a water collecting system.
Yeah, like a cistern. Yes, I'm sure that's possible. Absolutely. Anything's possible. We've given enough time and money, anything is possible.
I think that there's one place that this could work, and that would be away from the house on the south side,
Away from the house on the south side. You mean here?
behind the driveway,
Here.
front of the garden shed.
Yeah, like maybe around here somewhere.
Yeah,
That
I don't
sounds like a great idea. Thank you for getting us back on topic, Carrie. I appreciate that. So if
Get
we're
the
having,
morning sun and the afternoon sun there.
yeah, and if I need a 12-foot by 16-foot vegetable garden, I can look at my scale. There's 16, there's like another 16. So actually, if I want to do a vegetable garden, maybe it's there. Okay, we're rolling. Look at that. There's the vegetable garden. General, and this is why we sometimes call functional diagrams a bubble diagram, because we're just drawing bubbles. We're thinking about where it might go. Because here's what this is like. This is like us putting a puzzle together, but we lost the box. Right? So we need to figure out where these things will go. So okay, so the next thing up is a water feature. Oh boy, here we go with water again.
I think the answer is clear.
Well, okay. So think about it though. What do they want the water feature for?
What do they want it for? I don't
Well, that's a
remember.
good question. So we would need to know that. So I know what you're thinking. We put the water feature here, right? What
Well, the
kind of
runoff's
water
a problem.
Thank you. What kind of water feature will that be?
Dirty.
Thank
Bog.
you. Very, very dirty. Because remember, when water comes running across the property, it's bringing everything that it dissolved from uphill with it. So it's not just soil, it's fertilizer and pesticides and herbicides and animal excrement and all a number of things that are dissolved in that water right there. Right? So, okay, maybe it is a water, but they didn't say what kind of water feature it is. So maybe this is more like a bog. Okay. And actually, it only needs to be 8 by 8. I drew that more like 16, so that's actually twice as big. That's what they asked for. But if we're going to put it here, it's going to have to just be the whole wet spot. So there we go. All right. Shed and storage, 10 by 18. How big is our existing building? It is like 14 by 20. So that's plenty big. So there we go. It's already determined for us. We built a shed. How about patio dining space? Where would I want to put that?
I would put it in front of all the entrances and exits on east side.
On the east side, like somewhere around here.
Where the shade is, yeah.
Where the
So
shade
it
is.
has access. So it has access actually in a kitchen as well. So essentially, it would span, if the numbers allow, to connect. It's an extension of the house, so it would connect the kitchen, the den, and the living room, I believe.
This is like a library.
Or library.
Yeah.
Having the kitchen and den would be great, especially if they wanted, what was it, 5 to 8 people over, and then as you know, like Chris grew up and had friends over, you have a bunch of people over. I don't know, whenever we have gatherings like that, I feel like people are always in and out of the kitchen, people are hanging out in the dining room, people are back and forth through the den. You have some snacks in the kitchen, some snacks outside right by the door, maybe some drinks outside. So people are kind of back and forth between those 3 spaces a lot, it seems, at least in my experience.
Yeah. 16. There's 12.
And I guess if you wanted a sunny portion of it, it looks like you could extend it out from the kitchen a little bit and have an area right there.
Yeah. So
And I would potentially connect it with the den if the owners would agree, if that would make more practical sense to connect the patio in front of the den.
All right. So there's our vegetable garden, there's our water feature, shed and storage, patio for dining space, area for conversation. So we're off to a pretty good start. And thinking about the relationship of these things, this actually makes sense based on the things that you were just saying. So here's our dining space, its relationship to the kitchen. Maybe the library also doubles as a dining space, or maybe this is where we do like a little buffet setup and you can bring food outside. And this whole thing's actually starting to work very nicely. That feels good. Maybe before dinner, we sit here and we gather for appetizers and a cocktail. That we have a view here. Oh, there's a nice view of our bog garden. We can look into there. All right. what else is happening with our garden space? Because this is all these are all the things my client asked for, right? So we're done.
Shaded area. We have to take care of the shaded area, the fence.
Right. So here's what happens a lot of times is we go through our list of the things that the client asked for, and we have all this space left over. So what do we do? Do we
Work
just
our way
go,
out
okay,
from there.
pardon me?
Work our way out from there.
Yeah, right. So what are we going to do? I mean, so I'll tell you one thing that we're not going to do. We're not going to do that. No, 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 no. Right? Wrong. So, so what would make sense? So we also have some other things here that either the client asked for, or we would take upon ourselves and use our creativity to say, well, all right, conversation space, dining room, patio, but what else do we have in our site analysis? Views, bad view over here, right? If I'm standing here, I'm looking straight into my neighbor's house. What can I do?
Some trees, something tall enough. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So let me go down in here. There's my property line. I'll make that more obvious. There's my property line. And so maybe I can go like this. Screen, right? Now I can screen out all that bad view, all right? And then over here, I think, now I'm having a hard time seeing because things are getting kind of cluttered. So tell you what, I think I am done with, let's just take this out, make this easier to read. Yeah, a bit easier to read. We've got some bad views there. We got some good views over here. Let's just say, for instance, we're looking around thinking, you know what, also from the den, I had that picture when I was on site, and this looked like a really nice view over here. So maybe, remember what I said about designing for theme and creating well-composed spaces? One of the things that can be really helpful is to organize a space is maybe thinking about focal point. So maybe something like here could be my focal point. I know
Isn't there already a crabapple tree or something like that?
There is, right there.
And it can be very picturesque. It can go for also for seasons.
Yeah, the crabapple is lovely, but maybe the crabapple is not lovely all the time. Or maybe we want something a little bit more. Maybe we're thinking, hey, you know, maybe that crabapple can be part of a scene that we create around here. Maybe this is some sort of an interesting
spring
garden
meadowland
space.
in the spring.
Right.
I mean, meadowland in the spring.
This is the crabapple garden. Right? Maybe that's it. Maybe that could be kind of nice. Right? And then maybe this over here is like the backdrop to the crabapple garden to make that an interesting scene. You see what I'm doing here? Right? So that might be a good use of my space. So this is functional diagram number 1, 923, 25. So we would do this exercise until we've addressed everything. Right? What is it looking like? Right? There's the shed, there's the vegetable garden. We have all these other spaces left over. What are they here for? What are they for? That's your job. right? This is the work part, right? This is where you need to tap into your creativity and imagine what this space is like. Sometimes you might start off with something a little bit corny, like this over here. I flex my dad joke a little bit. This is the crabapple garden, right? Okay, great. So how does that really benefit? Does it really benefit the client? One of the things to keep in mind when doing functional diagrams is that we want to keep these blobs, these areas, these functions, these bubbles, kind of proportionately spaced and sized appropriately for the activity that's happening, right? We used our scale before we drew the bubble. It's like, yeah, 12 by 16, that's about right for the vegetable garden, so forth. Same for the patio and dining space. So we drew them appropriately, right? So not only are they in the correct location relative to the site and our study of the function, but also to one another. The kitchen leads to the dining, leads to the conversation, leads to a water feature, leads to a view of this garden space, which doesn't have a name yet, right? To the crabapple garden. You see what I'm doing here? We're creating a sequence of spaces that have relationships to one another. But that's not quite enough. We need to start thinking about things like, what am I going to see? There's a nice view here. There's a nice view there. That looks really good. Maybe from the patio and dining garden, we have a nice view into here, right? Because there's something happening that you are defining as the designer, you're doing that. But it's not enough to just do those things. We also have to think about how we're going to get through the space. How are we going to move around it? So we have the size, the approximate size, and the placement and the function of each of these things. So now how are we going to move around, right? How do we get from one space to another? And this is important. One thing that you'll probably notice is that I have not labeled anything as a walkway, have I? Well, how are we going to get around it? No, there's no walkway. Well, guess what? A walkway is not a space. A walkway is not a space. A walkway is a connection between two spaces. So unless we're designing something specifically as a walkway, like a case in point, if you've been to Longwood Gardens, you know that there's a garden called the Brick Walk, right? And the Brick Walk is literally a brick walkway with seasonal plantings on either side, right? And you walk from one end to the other, and you see color changes as you go along. So that was intentionally designed as a walkway. The walkway is a space and is there because of the walkway. We're not designing any gardens here that are a walkway. Instead, we're going to think about how we get from one space to the next and think about our experience in doing so. For instance, if I'm going from the kitchen to the patio, we're going to come right into the patio space. But then how do I get from the patio to the conversation space, right? So the easy answer might be, well, we just go directly here. Right? And that's fine. But then like maybe we could, instead of doing this, maybe the way that we get to the conversation space is maybe a little bit more circuitous. And we go through this garden in order to get to the conversation space. So in order to go from patio, the dining patio, to the conversation space, maybe we go through this garden, just as an example. I know that doesn't make any sense, but just trying to make a point. So what I'm saying is this. We have the opportunity, based on the way that we arrange our spaces, to either move right through the middle of the space, or we might walk through the seam created between the two spaces. What happens, what's different about the space if I walk through the middle of it versus walking in between two different spaces?
You add space. You have
Variety,
different,
interest,
So what was your first comment? I'm adding what? I'm adding
variety,
no, the
interest.
first comment from the gentleman.
Oh, sorry.
Eric, sorry.
I forget what I even said now. you're changing things up. You're kind of forcing people to take a route that you want. You can maybe decorate it or change what they're looking at. Like if they're forced to take turns, you're changing where their view's going.
I think the first thing you said was you're adding space by going through the middle
Yeah,
of
you're
it.
making a thing bigger. Like if you add a visual barrier or even just a physical barrier, it takes you longer to get from one place to another. If you add a visual barrier in the middle of the thing that you have to walk around instead of walking through, it could make a place seem bigger because, like, if you're looking down a straight hallway, and you can see all the way to the end of it versus looking around like the green wall in Longwood Gardens. You have that add that curve to it so you can't see all the way to the end. So it's like, oh, what's on the other side? What if I turn this corner? There's more. You don't know what's down there until you walk all the way there and look.
Right.
So it kind of makes the place bigger.
let me cut you off there. So you're kind of right and you're also kind of wrong.
Okay.
Actually, by cutting through the middle of the garden, we actually take away space from that space because now we need to accommodate people to go through that garden. So whereas before I had this enormous space where I can do all my gardening, right? Now I need a place for people. So now I've broken it up. Whereas if I go through the seam, and also I kind of split this in half, didn't I? Whereas if I go through the seam, I actually I'm preserving more continuity of space in between, right? So think about how we're linking this together. What was the second comment? Adding variety, is that what you said? From the second comment that was made.
I said it was interest and variety. So it makes it interesting when you go through a garden.
It does. It does do that. However, when I go through this garden, all I'm seeing is this garden. Whereas if I go through the seam in between, on my left, I see the vegetable garden, and on my right, I see this garden. All right. So here's my point, is we have a choice as to how we arrange our space. We might think about this space here, and I know that I have a doorway here. I might think about this and go, I don't want to walk through this space. I want to have the choice of walking down the middle of the two, and I make a turn this way, I'm in this space. I make a turn that way, I'm in another, right? Because this is area A and this is area B. Right. So we need to think about how we're connecting, right? It might be some obvious things like getting from the sidewalk to the door, but then if I'm going from this door over to here, now I'm getting back to the sidewalk. It's like, this is interesting. So now I have like a walkway here and a walkway there. So they're like right next to each other. I'm going to put another walkway to get into the garden over here. So 1, 2, 3 walkways all coming into my landscape. Do I want that? I don't know. Wonder if maybe I could only have one walkway out over here or one over here and take one of those away. Because the more movement we do through the landscape, the less room we have to do things. Think about rooms in your house. The more passageways or walkways you have through a room, the less room you have for furniture, right? Because you're preserving room for people to move around. So if you're seeing a garden space that has a lot of arrows going in and out of it, know that, right? That's a big cluster. Similar to the way that we were studying the movement of water, that's getting very congested. So the fewer arrows we have going through spaces, the less congested it's going to feel, right? So not only are we planning for the space and the size of it and its relationship to one another, but we're also planning for the views and we're planning for the circulation. How are we going to move around it? Not by drawing in walkways, but by drawing in arrows that show the connections. And you might get to this point or a point earlier than this and go, you know what? I need to do better than this. That's why we do it as bubbles, because you're not going to get this right the first time, or even the second, or even the third time, right? You're going to need to do this a few times until you get this to be something efficient that that you think is a good try. And then, just because, I mean, this is supposed to be work, and it is. This is functional diagram number 1. This is one possible solution.
I have a question though.
Hold on to your question for 1 second. And I'm going to make a point and then we'll move on. Hold on 1 second. So because this is one pass, we said, okay, conversation space, time space here. So that's great. Here's my house. what if I put my conversation space over here? And I can still keep my water garden there. And then what if I pushed my dining space out to here and made this all kind of green garden space? That's green. Look at this conversation, that's dining. And then maybe I've got this garden space in here, right? What if I do some other things? Or what if I want to put my conversation space over here in the shade rather than over there, right?
Mhm.
So as your assignment is also going to be to create 2 functional diagrams. Okay, your question.
My question is, when we create those paths, isn't it kind of natural and human nature to pick the shortest route wherever we're getting? So we essentially, even if we create a winding path, well, most of the time we'll try and use the shortcut from
Yeah,
the practical point of
and
view.
that's exactly what people will do unless you put something in their way to make them go a different direction.
Then they won't go there.
Sure they will. If you make it to something that is
exciting.
as pleasing and interesting, right? That's where the mystery and legibility part comes in, right?
Gotcha.
So we're saying, okay, here's a pathway, here's a sequence through the garden. No, don't look over there, look over here, right? Because I put something tall over here to block your view, so you look over there, right? So yes, it is human nature to take the shortest distance. So it's our job to think about how we want people to go. And then the next step from this one is going to be, well, then how do I make sure that someone goes this way and not that way? You follow?
I do.
That's the next step. That's the next step. So this week's assignment is to create site analysis and document the existing conditions as described in the assignment. So you're going to do, actually, let me pull up the assignment so I'm not speaking out of turn.
While you do that, can I ask a
Yes.
question? It's Monica.
Yes.
So this original base map has a driveway.
Mm-hmm.
Are we getting rid of it? I mean, of course, we always could if that's what they want. But
Yep.
I didn't hear, I mean, I heard, yeah, parking on the street's okay, but sounds like we still need, or is that we still need a driveway to park our personal cars? Or are we, did I miss something?
So here's this, I'll give you the story. So there's basically only 3 things that are immovable: the house, the shed, well, 4: house, the shed, the property lines, and the sidewalk. Right? Because the sidewalk belongs to the town. The property lines, unless we buy the neighbors next door, we can't change the property lines. And we're not going to tear down the house or the shed. Everything else is up for discussion.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
All right, great.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So your assignment is to prepare a site analysis on one sheet that documents desirable and undesirable view lines and general sun and shade patterns, right? So basically this drawing, right? Create a drawing that documents sun and shade and view lines. On a separate sheet, you're going to prepare 2 different functional diagrams. Functional diagram number 1, functional diagram number 2 of equal levels of completeness. I just did a quick example here. It should be more like this, but a little bit more readable. You can color this if you want, but it's not necessary. What I am interested in seeing you do is stretching your brain, stretching your creativity, stretching the realms of possibility as to where things could go. If you show me a functional diagram number 1 that has the patio and conversation space here, and you just flip them, come on, work a little bit harder than that, right? Fine, it's like, do this, and now try to do something that's completely different, right? Stretch yourself and see if you can come up with 2 distinctively different functional diagrams, right? So you'll be submitting 3 sheets, 1 sheet for site analysis, and then 2 separate sheets for 2 different functional diagrams.
Are these generally freehand or should be freehand, I guess?
I always do these freehand. Well, for the most part. I mean, some site analysis depends on how I'm going to be using it. I might draft those, but this is supposed to be freehand. Typically speaking, the client does not see this drawing. This is for you. This is a step in the process. So it needs to be readable, but freehand. This needs to be easy. So you can get to this point, and this should not have taken too long. Maybe this took 20 minutes, right? And you go, you know what? I don't like this one. I'm gonna get rid of this one, try again, right? That's why the bubbles. That's why we're not taking a lot of time to make everything perfect. But it does need to be readable. All the bubbles need to touch. All the functions need to make sense. They need to point back to the program statement.
I have one more question, and that is the 5 functions that we have over on the left. I didn't hear.
This is just an example based on my lecture. This is not your project.
Okay. Yep, thanks.
Yep. If I used your project, then you would all just draw my drawing just like the way that I drew it, and I don't want to do that, right?
Thank you.
So it's intentionally different.
So I think I asked last time if the architecture was all kind of set in stone, but did that count for the shed? It seemed like maybe we could add another shed if we wanted to do something else with that shed,
We're going to add another shed, that's fine.
Okay.
But this shed stays.
Or just maybe extend that shed or tack something onto the back of it that's like
take your best shot.
Maybe okay.
But this shed stays.
So then I'm a bit lost. So what are the needs of the customer? Is it the one we discussed last week?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So we disregard today.
This is just an example. I don't do this. Do it based on the program statement that you created last week.
Got it.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Darren, the trees are staying, right?
Say again?
Back? Are the trees staying in the back?
The only thing that has to stay is the house, the shed, the property lines, and the sidewalk.
Okay.
If you want to move trees, take out trees, you can do that.
I just have one last question, and it's because I met with this dilemma in a private life. What can be planted on the septic field?
Not trees and shrubs.
But grasses, meadows, and flowers, perennials, things like that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay. All right. So give it your best shot. The assignment is in D2L. Give yourself some time to play with this, right? Give yourself time to try, fail, try again, right? Because you're not going to get this right the first time, or even the second or third. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
class.
Good night.
Sorry. Yes. One
Yes.
more question.
Go for it.
We did talk about drainage a little bit earlier and impenetrable surfaces. Where does turf come into that? Is that considered, since I heard it was not very impenetrable for like something that is technically penetrable?
Right. So since the client doesn't want lawn at all.
Right. I just meant in general.
Oh, in general,
Yeah.
it's not the turf that makes something permeable or impermeable, it's the soil.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Sure, no problem. All right, everybody. Thanks. Good night.
All right.